On a crisp autumn evening, the Noble Oak Tavern was alive with chatter and laughter. The flickering candlelight danced across its weathered wooden beams, casting a golden hue on the faces of patrons who gathered to escape the cold. The air was rich with the scent of roasted meats and freshly brewed ale, a comforting aroma that wrapped around each visitor like a warm embrace. Nobles in their embroidered cloaks mingled effortlessly with tradesmen, creating a rare tapestry of humanity. Yet, amidst this vivid display of camaraderie, one corner remained quieter. A lone figure sitting still, his shadow blending into the dim light. The tavern thrived as a meeting ground for tales and transactions alike. At one table, a merchant boasted of his travels across distant lands, regaling his audience with vivid descriptions of foreign markets. At another, a knight recounted his brush with danger on the battlefield, his audience clinging to every word. There was an air of emotional connection, one that transcended social class in the moment. Yet, not all who gathered shared in this display of joy and companionship. In the far corner, the mysterious man sat unnoticed, sipping slowly from his humble goblet, observing rather than partaking. This bustling scene was far more than just a medieval drama. It was a slice of life that revealed so much about human nature. People sought warmth, not only from the fire but from the presence of others, their laughter and shared stories acting as a balm against life's harshness. Compassion could be found in fleeting gestures, a kind word exchanged between strangers, or the innkeeper's subtle smile as she passed. And yet, the stranger in the corner seemed untouched by these small acts, as though he preferred solitude to the buzzing energy around him. Even in such an animated space, empathy was selective, reserved for those who fit the mold of the tavern's lively spirit. The stranger, with his simple attire, drew no attention. He didn't laugh or cheer, nor did he boast about exploits or wealth. It was easy to overlook someone who didn't demand the spotlight. This subtle exclusion, intentional or not, was a reminder of how quickly society can divide itself. Those with stories to share and those who remain quiet, their tales left untold. The tavern itself, a central pillar of medieval life, was more than just a place to eat and drink. It was a stage where roles were played and hierarchies revealed. Nobles received the finest mead, while commoners scraped together enough coins for the simplest brew. It was in these unspoken dynamics that the evening unfolded, each person contributing to the greater narrative. But the stranger's silence was its own kind of contribution, a contrast to the noise that begged the question, who was he and why was he here? As the night deepened, the buzz of the tavern began to lull, leaving the faint crackle of the hearth and the occasional murmur of conversation. Yet, the stranger's presence lingered, like an unanswered question hanging in the air. What secrets did he carry in his quiet demeanor? And why did he seem so at peace, despite the chaos around him? The answers would soon unravel, setting the stage for a tale of compassion, empathy, and redemption unlike any other.
We are just at the beginning of a channel that will be huge and will bring incredible medieval emotional stories, and you can help us just by subscribing, activating the bell, and leaving your like. Comment if you feel motivated by this story.
He sat motionless in the corner, his form almost swallowed by the shadows cast by the flickering hearth. Dressed in a cloak that had seen better days, its edges frayed and dulled, the stranger exuded an air of quiet mystery. His hands, calloused and worn, cradled a simple wooden goblet, a stark contrast to the ornate silver tankards clinking around the room. There was no insignia to mark him as noble, no badge of honor on his chest, just a plain tunic, boots thick with dust, and a calm, steady gaze that seemed to pierce the very soul of the room. To the casual observer, he was merely a traveler, perhaps a farmer from the outer lands or a tradesman on his way to the next market. But to anyone who truly looked, if they dared to, the stranger's demeanor betrayed something deeper. He wasn't uneasy, nor did he shrink under the weight of the tavern's boisterous energy. Instead, he watched it all with the serenity of someone who had seen far more in life than the revelry of a medieval tavern could offer. His stillness was almost unsettling, as if he knew something no one else did. What truly set him apart, though, was his eyes. They weren't the weary eyes of a man beaten down by life, nor were they filled with envy for the wealthier patrons. No, they held a quiet strength, the kind of resolve that can only come from facing countless storms and walking away stronger. If empathy were to take a human form, it might look like this stranger, stoic, yet deeply aware of the world around him. His gaze swept over the room, observing every laugh, every boast, every fleeting moment of vulnerability with the kind of attention that made you feel seen. And yet, he was invisible to them. The merchants were too busy counting their coin, the knights too enthralled by their own tales of bravery. Even the tavern keeper, a woman who prided herself on noticing every detail of her establishment, barely spared him a glance. It was a reminder of how quickly people judge by appearances, failing to look beyond the surface. In this medieval drama, where every character seemed to vie for recognition, the stranger's anonymity was both his shield and his shroud. Despite the tavern's warmth, a chill seemed to cling to him. It wasn't the chill of the autumn air, but something heavier, something born from within. Was it sorrow? Compassion? Or perhaps a burden so profound it had shaped him into the man he was? Whatever it was, it hung around him like an invisible cloak, unnoticed by the bustling crowd, but impossible to ignore for anyone who truly paid attention. He seemed out of place yet wholly at home, as if he belonged to another world entirely. But what drew him here? Of all the places he could have chosen to rest, why this particular tavern, on this particular night? As he lifted his goblet and took a deliberate sip, his lips curling into the faintest of smiles, it became clear that his presence was no accident. He wasn't here to merely observe. He was here for a purpose, and soon, that purpose would unravel, bringing with it a tale of compassion, empathy, and redemption that no one in the Noble Oak Tavern could have anticipated. Helena moved through the Noble Oak Tavern with the confidence of someone who believed the world revolved around her. Her smile was polished, her tone rehearsed to perfection, and her eyes always scanning for opportunity. She wasn't just a tavern keeper. She saw herself as a hostess of prestige, a gatekeeper to the tavern's reputation. Every gesture was calculated, from the way she poured mead for a noble to the effortless charm she sprinkled in her conversations. Yet, behind her grace was a relentless ambition, one that valued appearance over substance. Her aspirations weren't inherently wrong. After all, who wouldn't dream of rising above their station in life? Helena imagined herself as more than a mere servant to knights and merchants. She craved recognition, respect, perhaps even whispers of her name in the courts of the realm. But this desire, unchecked, came at a cost. Those who didn't wear fine cloaks or carry heavy coin purses became invisible to her. It wasn't malice, it was a calculated strategy, one that she believed would elevate her standing. As Helena worked the room, her gaze swept over the crowd like a falcon searching for its prey. She zeroed in on the wealthiest patrons, offering them her most radiant smile and ensuring their every need was met before they even had to ask. A spilled drink? She was there with a fresh goblet before the noble could frown. A request for entertainment? She'd summon the local bard without hesitation. But as she lavished attention on the elites, the humbler patrons faded into the background, reduced to mere shadows in her field of vision. Compassion had no place in Helena's world, at least not for those who couldn't advance her goals. When a farmer stumbled in with mud-streaked boots, she greeted him with thinly veiled disdain, ensuring he knew his place in the hierarchy of her tavern. Her actions weren't born of cruelty. They were the result of a belief system that measured worth in gold and status. This emotional story of ambition was one many could relate to, a pursuit of success that often blinds us to the humanity in others. The stranger in the corner caught her eye once or twice, but only briefly. He didn't fit the image of the clientele she wanted to cater to. His cloak was worn, his goblet plain, and his demeanor far too unassuming. Helena dismissed him as unimportant, a man who added no value to her carefully crafted image of a prestigious medieval tavern. If anything, his presence irked her, as though his simplicity tarnished the elegance she worked so hard to maintain. Little did she know, her focus on the glittering facades of the room would be her undoing. The stranger's quiet presence wasn't a flaw in her evening's plan. It was the very test she needed to confront her misguided values. As she turned her attention back to the nobles, the The stage was quietly being set for a lesson she would never forget, one rooted in empathy, humility, and a truth far greater than her ambition. Helena's footsteps echoed across the tavern floor as she approached the stranger, her expression a mix of forced politeness and veiled irritation. To her, he was an outlier, a blemish on an otherwise perfect evening. His modest clothing and calm demeanor clashed with the glittering nobles and boisterous merchants. She couldn't fathom why someone like him would choose to linger in her prized establishment, and the more she glanced at him, the more her irritation simmered beneath the surface. She had worked too hard to build the tavern's reputation to let a simpleton ruin its aura of sophistication. As she passed by his table, her thoughts betrayed her outward composure. What business did a man like this have in a medieval tavern that catered to the elite? Surely, he would be more comfortable in a roadside alehouse, sharing crude jokes with farmhands. Her scorn was thinly veiled when she offered him a terse smile, the kind that spoke louder in judgment than in kindness. Yet, the stranger remained unbothered, his calm gaze meeting hers with an unsettling sense of understanding. It was as if he could see straight through her facade. Helena's disdain wasn't just directed at the stranger himself. It was rooted in her fear of what he represented. Simplicity, humility, qualities that, to her, clashed with the polished image she had crafted for the Noble Oak Tavern. In her eyes, simplicity wasn't a virtue but a weakness, a failure to rise above one's station. Every time she glanced at the stranger, it was as though he reminded her of the life she was determined to leave behind. A life where compassion and empathy were luxuries, not necessities. Her sharp tongue slipped as she stopped at his table. Perhaps the common room or the stables might be more to your liking, she suggested with an air of mock politeness. The words hung in the air, laden with condescension. The patrons nearby paused their conversations, some pretending not to hear, while others glanced at the exchange with thinly veiled curiosity. The stranger, however, did not react as she expected. He simply tilted his head, his lips curling into a faint smile, as though her scorn meant nothing to him. Helena's words weren't just a reflection of her own insecurities. They were a harsh commentary on the unspoken rules of the medieval drama unfolding around her. The value of a person, in her eyes, was measured by their coin, their attire, their status. And yet, the stranger's unshaken demeanor planted a seed of doubt, one she wasn't ready to confront. His lack of reaction only fueled her frustration, leaving her to wonder if he was mocking her in his silence. In truth, she was beginning to feel the weight of her own arrogance. As Helena moved away from his table, she threw one last glance over her shoulder, expecting the stranger to shrink under her disdain. But instead, his presence seemed to grow, not in stature but in significance. His simplicity, once an annoyance, was becoming a quiet challenge to her carefully constructed world. And though she couldn't yet articulate it, something about this man unsettled her in a way that none of the wealthy patrons ever could. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of her unraveling. Miguel, the young stable boy, stood quietly near the edge of the tavern, his hands rough from a day of labor and his eyes keenly observing the bustling room. While Helena flitted between the tables, her scornful tone toward the mysterious stranger did not escape his notice. Unlike the nobles and merchants, who had turned a blind eye, Miguel felt an undeniable pang of unease. He couldn't quite explain it, but something about the way Helena dismissed the stranger as unworthy stirred a sense of injustice within him. It wasn't right, he thought, for anyone to be judged so harshly on appearance alone. For months, Miguel had worked in the shadows of the Noble Oak Tavern, unnoticed and undervalued by most. His tasks were thankless: hauling barrels of ale, tending to the horses, and scrubbing the floors long after the last patron had left. Yet, despite his humble station, he carried himself with quiet dignity. He had always admired those who treated others with empathy, regardless of rank. Watching Helena mock the stranger made his chest tighten with frustration. If no one else would speak up, perhaps it was his duty to act. Gathering his courage, Miguel stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The tavern grew quieter as his small frame entered the light of the hearth, his voice steady yet soft. "Mistress Helena," he began, his tone laced with respect but firm. "Perhaps we should judge our guests not by their garments but by their character." His words, though simple, carried a weight that caused several heads to turn. The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension thick as Miguel met Helena's gaze with unwavering resolve. Helena's eyes narrowed, her irritation clear. "Mind your place, boy," she retorted, her voice sharp enough to cut through the thickest hide. "You're here to bust tables, not give lectures." But Miguel didn't flinch. Instead, he looked toward the stranger, who sat quietly, his faint smile betraying no hint of surprise or offense. In that moment, Miguel felt a strange sense of reassurance, as though the stranger's calm was lending him strength. "Even the simplest among us deserve kindness," Miguel said, his voice growing steadier. "Isn't that what makes this tavern noble?" The stable boy's words rippled through the room, their simplicity striking a chord with those who had overheard. A few patrons exchanged murmurs, while others avoided eye contact altogether, unwilling to face the uncomfortable truth of his statement. Helena, for all her sharpness, found herself momentarily speechless. She hadn't expected defiance from someone like Miguel, and the conviction in his voice unsettled her. Yet, instead of admitting fault, she clung to her pride, dismissing his words with a haughty flick of her wrist. As Miguel retreated back to his shadowed corner, the stranger's gaze lingered on him, a silent acknowledgement of the courage he had shown. Miguel felt his cheeks flush under the weight of that glance. But he also felt something else: pride. It wasn't the kind of pride that came from accolades or wealth, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had done what was right. Little did he know, his actions had set the stage for a revelation that would shake the foundation of the Noble Oak Tavern and forever change its keeper. The room was still abuzz with quiet murmurs after Miguel's bold words, though the tension had begun to settle. The stranger, however, remained as calm and composed as ever, his movements deliberate as he took another measured sip from his simple goblet. It was as though he were waiting for the right moment to speak, observing the room with a gaze that saw far more than the surface. Then, with a steady hand, he set his goblet down and rose from his chair, his presence suddenly commanding in a way no one had anticipated. The tavern seemed to hold its collective breath as he took a few steps forward, his cloak brushing lightly against the floor. Without raising his voice, he addressed the room, his tone carrying an air of quiet authority. "It's curious," he began, his words measured and deliberate, "how we often forget that appearances can deceive." His gaze swept over the crowd, lingering briefly on Helena, whose face had grown pale. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. The stranger continued, his voice steady but filled with undeniable weight. "Perhaps some here believe that status and wealth are the measures of worth. But let me offer you a different perspective." From within his cloak, the man produced a rolled parchment, tied with a simple strip of leather. The sound of it unrolling was almost deafening in the silence of the room. "This," he said, holding it up for all to see, "is the deed to this very tavern." Gasps rippled through the crowd, disbelief etched on their faces. Helena's eyes widened as the reality of the situation began to dawn on her. The man she had scorned, dismissed as a commoner, was no ordinary stranger. He was the lord of the castle, the true owner of the Noble Oak Tavern, and he had been watching her every move. The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air. Helena stumbled back a step, her hands clutching the edge of a nearby table for support. The patrons, once boisterous and merry, now sat in stunned silence, their eyes darting between the lord and the humiliated tavern keeper. The stranger, no, the lord, folded the parchment carefully and returned it to his cloak, his movements calm and deliberate. "I came here not as a lord," he explained, his voice now softer but no less commanding, "but as a guest, to see how this place truly operates. And now I see." Helena's lips trembled as she attempted to speak. "My lord, I didn't know," she stammered, her usual confidence replaced with raw vulnerability. But the lord raised a hand, silencing her with a gesture that was neither harsh nor forgiving. It was simply final. "No," he said, his tone firm. "You didn't know because you didn't look. You judge me by my appearance, not my actions." And in doing so, you revealed far more about yourself than you ever could about me. The silence in the tavern was palpable, broken only by the faint crackle of the hearth. Every eye was on the Lord, his words resonating deeply with those who had been content to ignore the stranger just moments before. But he wasn't finished. Tonight, he declared, his voice rising slightly, this tavern has taught me much. Not about hospitality, but about compassion, humility, and what it truly means to see the worth in others. His words lingered in the air like a challenge, not just to Helena, but to everyone in the room. And though they didn't yet know it, the lessons of this night were far from over. The weight of the Lord's words hung in the air like a dense fog, pressing down on everyone in the room. Helena's heart raced as she struggled to steady herself. For the first time in years, her carefully crafted confidence was cracking, revealing the insecurities and pride she had worked so hard to conceal. She cast her eyes downward, unable to meet the gaze of the man she had so harshly judged. The lords and knights she had catered to all night suddenly seemed insignificant in the presence of this unassuming figure, whose authority didn't need embellishment. The Lord, now seated once again at his humble table, spoke with a voice that was calm, yet carried the weight of conviction. True greatness, he said, addressing not just Helena but the entire room, isn't found in gold or titles. It's found in how we treat those we believe cannot offer us anything in return. His words struck a chord, cutting through the pretenses of the tavern like the edge of a well-honed blade. It was a lesson that echoed far beyond the confines of the Noble Oak Tavern, touching on the very fabric of human nature. Helena felt her cheeks burn with shame, but her mind churned with reflection. She had built her life around the idea that respect was earned through power, wealth, and status. Yet here stood a man who possessed all those things but chose to conceal them, placing more value on humility and kindness than on grandeur. Her scorn for simplicity now felt hollow, like an echo in an empty hall. And though she couldn't yet find the words to apologize, the seed of change had been planted deep within her. The patrons in the room, once loud and carefree, now sat quietly, their faces etched with a mixture of awe and discomfort. Many of them had indulged in the same shallow judgments as Helena, dismissing the stranger simply because he didn't fit the mold of what they considered important. The Lord's words weren't just a lesson for her. They were a mirror held up to everyone, reflecting their own failings in the light of his quiet dignity. It was a moment of collective reckoning, one that would linger long after the evening was over. The stable boy, Miguel, stood in the corner, his heart swelling with pride. The Lord's acknowledgement of his earlier courage felt like a validation of everything he believed in. That compassion and empathy were the true measures of a person's worth. He watched as Helena, once untouchable in her confidence, now wrestled with the truth she had ignored for so long. And while Miguel didn't speak, his presence was a quiet testament to the power of standing up for what's right, no matter one's station in life. As the fire crackled softly in the hearth, the Lord leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but resolute. The question, he said, his gaze fixed on Helena, is not whether this tavern can reclaim its nobility. The question is whether you can. His words weren't laced with anger or condemnation. They were a challenge, one that left no room for denial. The lesson had been delivered, but its true impact would only be revealed in the days to come. Helena stood frozen in place, the weight of the Lord's words pressing down on her like an invisible force. Her pride, once a towering wall, now crumbled in the face of undeniable truth. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of a nearby table, her head bowed in shame. For years, she had built her identity around ambition and appearances, believing that success came from catering to power and wealth. Yet now, standing before the Lord, she realized how hollow those ideals truly were. The room seemed to shrink, leaving her alone with her regrets. Slowly, she found the courage to raise her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "My Lord," she began, her voice trembling but sincere, "I was wrong." The words felt heavy on her tongue, but they carried a newfound humility she had never known. "I judged you unfairly. I judged others unfairly. I thought I was protecting this tavern's reputation, But I see now that I was only protecting my own pride. The patrons watched in stunned silence as Helena bared her soul, her vulnerability stark against the polished image she had once projected. The Lord regarded her with a steady gaze, neither harsh nor forgiving. "Words," he said softly, "are the beginning. Actions must follow." Helena nodded, her resolve hardening as she wiped away a stray tear. She turned to Miguel, the young stable boy who had shown more courage and wisdom in a single night than she had in years. "Miguel," she said, her voice steadier now, "I owe you an apology as well. You spoke the truth when I refused to hear it. Thank you for reminding me of what truly matters." Miguel blinked in surprise, his face flushing as he nodded silently, unsure how to respond. Helena's redemption didn't come in grand gestures or flowery speeches. It came in the quiet promises she made to herself. She vowed to treat every guest with the respect they deserved, regardless of their attire or status. She would no longer chase the approval of the wealthy at the expense of her integrity. And most importantly, she would work to earn back the trust of those she had wronged, starting with the Lord and the patrons of the Noble Oak Tavern. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she felt ready to change. The atmosphere in the tavern shifted subtly, the tension giving way to something warmer, almost hopeful. The patrons who had witnessed the drama began to relax, their conversations resuming in hushed tones. But this time, there was a difference. Eyes that had once darted around in judgment now softened with understanding. Helena could feel the shift, a small but significant step toward a better future. She straightened her apron and walked with purpose, determined to prove herself not just to the Lord, but to everyone in the room. As the night wore on, the Lord rose from his seat, his presence as commanding as ever. He glanced at Helena one last time, his expression unreadable. "Let this be a lesson," he said, his voice carrying over the quiet murmur of the room, "that nobility is not found in titles or gold, but in how we treat one another." With that, he turned and walked toward the door, leaving behind not just a room full of humble patrons, but a story that would be told for years to come. And as Helena watched him leave, she knew her journey was just beginning.